Dear Joe Rogan, here's the things that I agree with you with on episode, it's actually 1365. I wrote the previous one down. 1365 with Cameron Hanes. You guys get into talking about, trophy hunters and the difference between trophy hunters and the kind of hunting you guys do for meat. To eat the meat and the respect that you have for the animals. So let's start with the things that, I'm in agreement with. And that is, most people don't understand the difference between trophy hunting and what you guys are doing. And I was the same way. So before I started listening to your podcast, I didn't really get it either. I kind of equated hunters with these trophy hunters that get plastered all over social media. And when I started listening to you and I listened to your intention behind why you hunt, that you had a problem with factory farming, that you started to become aware of the practices in this industry and that, horrified you. And so you got into hunting your own meat because that was the only other alternative for you. You weren't going to give up meat, but you said very clearly in one episode, a previous episode, not this one, that if you couldn't hunt your own meat, that you were prepared to give it up because you just wouldn't contribute to the factory farming industry. And I had a great respect for that, and I could identify with that. I could agree with that wholeheartedly. And so a respect grew, for the motivation and the intention behind taking up, you ended up bow hunting, right? So taking up bow hunting. And I think that it would be really helpful for a lot of people to have this kind of understanding and understand the level of respect that most hunters that are hunting for meat have for the animal, for the life that they're taking, giving thanks for that meat, for the animal giving its life so that you can survive, so that you can live off of that meat. I think that's really important. So I'm really glad that you talk about that a lot on your podcast. And it's a point that it took me a while, in all honesty, it took me a while to come around to. It didn't feel comfortable at first to listen to it. And, I went vegan for 2 years after I read the China study. I wanted to see how it felt for myself. I'm the kind of person that needs to try everything for myself to see how it makes me feel and decide whether that's right for me or not. And after 2 years, I went back to meat to see how that made me feel, to reincorporate it. And what I found was that there was, now, again, I'm not eating like hunted elk, so, maybe that would have made a difference. But, I didn't know then what I know now. So I went back to eating meat, and I found that there was a very small level of meat that I could tolerate in my diet before I started to feel lethargic and gross again. So I could eat meat like once a week, maybe twice a week, without feeling gross. So I sort of played with that threshold for a little while, and then eventually I ended up just going vegetarian. But with not eating dairy. So I would mainly just eat eggs. Dairy never really agreed with my skin. So I kind of had this, my own journey with veganism and then going back to it. And now I actually do eat meat a few times a year. And this is kind of controversial, for me, in the sense that I know that there's a lot of people who would be vegan or vegetarian and maybe harbor a little bit of judgment there, but that's okay. I don't hide it. I'm very open about the fact that, we eat vegetarian. We actually eat vegan really in our house most of the time. My partner would prefer not to eat eggs and cheese. I do still eat eggs and cheese, and I do eat meat occasionally. This is how I tend to feel my best. So again, I resonate with this idea that a lot of people who give up veganism will go back, or who take up veganism will go back to eating some level of meat, because I've seen it in myself and I've seen it in a lot of my friends. And this is not really a matter of willpower. This is about feeling my best. My body starts to crave meat after a while. And I can have a very small amount and be satiated. That goes away for, a period of time. And I tend to think that this is more like our ancestral eating of meat, right? We didn't always have access to large quantities of meat throughout our evolutionary history. It's only in recent history that we, have the tools and have the resources to hunt large amounts of meat and be able to eat meat at every meal or every day, etc., etc. So, listening to you on this episode in particular, 1365, it was intriguing, and I definitely would like to try eating something like, the wild game, the wild elk. You speak so highly of it, and a lot of hunters that I've listened to speak very highly of elk meat. So, and the energy that comes from that. So, being very in tune with my body and aware of what my body is telling me, and listening to the signals, and using high quality supplementation and using really high quality foods, it's very intriguing. And I've often said, I think if everybody had to kill their own meat in order to eat meat, we would have a lot fewer people eating meat, and we would have a lot greater respect for hunters such as yourself. I do think that awareness, Cameron says this, I think that awareness is growing in terms of where our food comes from, and that's terrific. And this is sort of where there's, a level of disagreement. And, you make this point so many times on your podcast that, vegetarians are consuming large amounts of vegetables and large amounts of grain, and they have no idea the damage they're doing in terms of greenhouse gas emission, all the lives that they're taking through this large scale agriculture. And, there's this underlying assumption that all vegetarians or all vegans, or most, don't care where their vegetables come from, right? And, are okay with large-scale factory farming of their vegetables. And that's just not the case, right? On the same note that many people are caring where their meat comes from, a lot of people are caring where their vegetables come from too, and their grains, right? So for me personally, we support our local CSA, our community supported agriculture. We have a farmer that we know very well, that we're friends with, and they grow our vegetables that we get throughout the season, throughout the summer. We're in Canada, so we don't have a year-round growing season, but that's so important to me. And we grow our own vegetables. There's a higher nutritional level, so much higher when you have enriched soil and all of these wonderful things that go into organic farming and local farming, and knowing where your food comes from, knowing the farmers that are producing your food. It's no different with vegetables, right? So it's this underlying assumption that kind of bugs me, right? That the same way people in general, for me, it would be the same people who don't care where their meat comes from, that they don't care where their vegetables and grain comes from, right? If people care enough about where their food comes from to be asking questions about their meat, hopefully, and chances are, they're also asking questions about where their produce is coming from and where their grains are coming from. And likewise, with vegetarians and vegans, you can't just assume that they're completely blind to the impact that their vegetarianism or their veganism is having on the environment as well, right? In terms of where their vegetables come from or their grains come from. I absolutely do not want enormous fields of corn and grain. That was one of the things that you said in this. I absolutely don't want that. There is an inherent problem with farms on that scale. And so that's why, even as a vegetarian, even as a vegan, I wanted to support local community agriculture and the farmers that are doing incredibly hard work. I don't know if you've ever talked to anyone that does CSA, or that farms produce by hand for their communities. It is hard fucking work. I've gone out with them and spent just a couple of hours in the field with them, and it is back-breaking labor. You guys talk about how hard you work for that meat when you hunt it. It is exactly the same for people who are farming day in, day out, maybe even harder. Now you guys are training for that. Well, these guys are working 10, 12 hours a day, back-breaking labor, doing all of this manual labor to produce vegetables for a small number of people, maybe a couple hundred people in their community. To me, that's just as admirable and commendable, and I am so appreciative, and I couldn't give enough thanks for the work that they do to put that food on my plate in my home, this nutritious, high-quality, clean food. And it's all vegetables, right? Fruit and vegetables. And they're concerned with where their meat comes from, right? So it's kind of all in the same realm. If people are caring about where their food's coming from, they're caring about where it's coming from, whether they're vegetarian, vegan, carnivore, omnivore, whatever, right? And they should be, and I think that's great. And overall, that's what we need more of. We just need more conscious consumption of everything, but especially of our food. And anyway, there's a few more points, like, Cameron very matter-of-factly says, animals must die for us to live. And I think, I still struggle with this, and even, not to be critical, like even listening to you guys talk about, how this animal dies and you give thanks for it. Just listening to that would bring me to tears, right? Thinking of how you describe that animal taking its last breaths, that's heart-wrenching for me. And I think for many people, it's very, very difficult, and I've never experienced it. Picking up a skunk on the side of the road and having that die, overnight, because he was sick, like bawling. There's just a level of pain watching an animal die that I think for many people is very real. And so I think that ultimately I would need to go on a hunt with hunters, as difficult, as horrendous as I think it would be. I think it's something that I would need to experience at some point to really understand it. But I do appreciate and hope that all hunters have that level of respect for the lives that they're taking. And I hope that it's not the case that animals have to die so that we can live, because there won't be any animals left at the rate that humans are growing if that's the case. So I think we need to be really conscientious also of the ideas that we put out there and the ideas that we promote on such significant platforms. And I think that's a dangerous one. This assumption that humans automatically gain the upper hand or gain superiority over animals. It's a give and take. And we couldn't be here without them either, So even just their contributions to the ecosystem, eating them aside, just that whole circle of life. And I think we need to be very mindful of that. That's all I got. Dear Joe Rogan, 1365.